ever so much, and it's lovely to see so many of you here this morning for a really exciting topic, looking at the opportunities that we have in soil health and sequestration. And soil is so incredibly important. There's an absolutely brilliant saying which says, despite everything that we've done as humans, all the technological innovations that we have, we owe our existence to the fact that we have 6 inches of soil and it rains. Soil is absolutely at the cornerstone and at the starting point of everything that we want to do in terms of sustainable farming systems, in terms of food production, in terms of water quality and air quality, in terms of supporting biodiversity, nutrient cycling, and then our unique ability as an industry to deliver those climate solutions. And that's very much what we're going to focus on as we go through this morning. Because for agriculture and for farmers, it's complicated when we think about greenhouse gas emissions and transition to net zero. As an industry, we are both a source and a potential sink. We know that soils are the second largest store of carbon, but it's complicated. It's biological. There are huge amounts of dependencies and variables in terms of how we manage those soils, in terms of the differences in soil type, in cropping systems, in climatic conditions, which means that it's quite challenging when we think about how we're actually going to support those farmers to improve soil health and build soil carbon and sequestration and some of those natural climate solutions as we move forward. But you'll be very glad to know that we have a fantastic panel this morning that's going to help us delve a little bit deeper into some of these topics. We first have Helen Browning. Helen is the Chief Executive of the Soil Association. She's also an organic livestock and arable farmer from Wiltshire. We've then got Claire Mackenzie, who is the producer of a fantastic film called 6 Inches of Soil. And if you haven't been able to get to a screening of that, I really recommend it because it's a fantastic insight into some different farmer journeys and stories about their experiences with soil health. And we'll hear a little bit more from Claire about what's been happening with those farmers as we move forward. We've then got Lionel Alexandre, who's our carbon business lead from Bayer. They are developing a global carbon initiative which is looking at working and linking that value chain, really understanding what we do around the technology, around agronomy, and also leading into that sort of regenerative agriculture movement, which we'll continue to think about as we move forward. And then last but by no means least, on the end, we have Andrew Voisey, who's the Chief Impact Officer at Soil Capital, which is the agronomy firm that launched the Regenerative Agriculture Transition Programme and has delivered the first certified carbon project. So we're absolutely honoured to have all these people here today. And again, we're going to try and really make the most of the time we've got. So as we go along, if you've got questions, please feel free to put them into the app and make sure that we can make the most of the expertise that we've got here. But just to start off, and so we can hear from all of our panel, in the work that you do and in the interactions that you have with your farmers, why is improving soil health important, and how does that feed into that sort of day-to-day work that you're doing? Helen, do you want to start us off?
Well, thank you, Becky. The Soil Association, founded in 1946, our entire mission was around the health of the soil and how that links to the health of people, the health of plants, the health of animals, that whole chain being so interconnected. So it's right at our very core. And of course, the work that the pioneers in the organic movement were doing, in the 1920s, and the 30s, 40s, all that work around mycorrhizal, the importance of soil organic matter, humus, farming, that all got swept away and forgotten about for a very long time as we went down the kind of specialization industrial route that farming's followed. But I think the Soil Association has been a bit of a voice in the wilderness over the last sort of 70, 75, 80 years, trying to hold that arc of knowledge alive. And now suddenly everybody's turned on by soil. And as you've just said so eloquently, everybody recognizes that soil is not only a huge necessity, but a big part of the solution around some of the challenges that are facing us. So we're right in the middle of all of this, trying to ensure that everybody has the expertise to drive better farming systems.
Claire, I think following on from what Helen was just saying, how have you managed to use the experiences through the film to make soil exciting and get people excited about the potential for soil?
Well, we're lucky today to have two people we've worked on the film with the Soil Association and Farm Carbon Toolkit feature in the film with Hannah Jones, and she enabled us particularly to bring the practical side to life. But what we did was keep a human story at the centre of it to engage anyone that eats really in the subject, because we really, really passionately, all of our team, from filmmakers to passionate environmentalists, particularly in the food and farming sector, who've worked on this project, believe that soil is at the centre and is the life force, and it's all interconnected. It's one big ecosystem. We look at agroecology, we look at everything working together. So if our soil isn't healthy, then our water, our air, and obviously ourselves and the planet will not survive. So that's been at the centre of it, and we were enabled to do that by following 3 young farmers and on their journey to turn around their soil on their farms, to regenerate not only the soil, but we saw them regenerate themselves as well, which is a key part of the conversation. But it's been a really amazing thing, and they're carrying on, and they talk about, whether they're capturing carbon, they're clean, the water infiltration rates are increasing, all of those things are happening, and it's been a 3-year project, and we've seen some amazing results.
Fantastic. Lionel, for you, again, in the work that you do, how does sort of soil health feature, and how do you support the farmers that you work with?
Thank you very much for the question. I think for us, soil is so important, because when we talk about soil, we talk about time. And that's something that is extremely important to understand. I know if in this group there are people that are not working in or for agriculture, but at least one element that is crucial is to understand that soil means time. Because when you work on soil, anything you do, you will suffer for it for years and years and years. And that's what you will give to your next generation, that's what you will give to your kids, to your potential future farmers on your land. And that's something that is really essential. So that's why for us it's really important. And when we talk about soil with our farmers, that's exactly what's happened. Say, hey, and let's go to the risk management. Anything I do might have deep consequence. And I want to do the right thing, to do the right element. And because soil is a ground for anything you produce. You are a grower, you might stop producing wheat, for example. You might, now we'll produce oilseed rape, or we'll produce potatoes, or I'll produce maize, or whatever. But on the same soil, because that's where things happen. So, that's why for us we feel it's extremely important, is because it really goes to this question of time. And probably we go to it in the conversation, it goes to maybe something that could be permanent. And that's a very important dimension when you start talking about carbon in agriculture. There is something linked to permanence that is crucial, and soil is the house of this.
I think that's a really good point that we'll pick up. And I think, Andrew, for you, it is that shift, isn't it, in terms of that short-term thinking, in terms of for that farm manager to thinking about how do we build resilience up over time. How within the work that you guys have been doing within Soil Capita have you supported those farmers to start to think over that longer term?
Yeah, so let's think about this from the farmer's point of view, but let's also make this real for the rest of us, because the consequences of what's happening to soil are very real for all of us right now, I think. Let's start from the acceptance that very many farmland soils that have been farmed industrially are now heavily degraded from a soil health point of view. And that's not something that farmers, I don't think, are typically proud of. They want to be the best stewards of land that they can be. It's not just a job, it's their livelihoods and their life. But we've created a food and agricultural system around them that has, especially for larger scale industrial farms, resulted in systematic degradation of the land. And so exiting that situation, Lionel, you talked about it. I mean, there are costs involved, but fundamentally I want us to hold on to this question of risk as well, because for a farmer being asked to sort of change the fundamentals of how they farm, that opens up a whole new world of risk where, frankly, they're already full to bursting with risk every day. So one of the pivot points in Soil Capital's journey, we started life as a team of farm advisors and land managers, doing the transition of practices on the ground. And what we quickly came to realize is that it's not just knowledge that's needed. It's also, frankly, better financial reward for taking that risk of changing your farming system. And I just want to actually make that subject of the financial reward personal to all of us, because there was a study done just before Christmas in the UK that looked at food price inflation and the drivers of food price inflation. And if you'd asked a well-educated audience, probably most of us would have said, well, the most important driver of what's making food more expensive is probably energy costs. I won't do it. But actually what the academic research is showing that today already, extreme weather, too much water and too little water, is already the biggest driver of food price inflation. And in the middle of that is soil, because soil is and should be a driver of resilience, a buffer to that. And we're in a situation right now where at least a fifth of the UK's cereal crop for harvest 2024 is not going to arrive because farmers can't get into their fields, they're waterlogged. And that is, again, a story about poor soil structure and soil health and water infiltration, as Claire talked about. So this is cost of living stuff for all of us today, the lack of soil health. And I want to make sure we unpack that as a thread through the conversation.
I think that's a really important point. As I say, soil connects us all together in terms of whether we're consumers, whether we're producers. And actually, as I say, the real volatility and I suppose issues that we have as we have these changing weather patterns. So just moving on from that, some of you have sort of touched a little bit on some of the barriers. So we've had sort of attitudes to risk, we've had finance, we've had research, we've had all these sorts of things. Let's just have a look at that in a little bit more detail. In terms of that idea of improving soil health, what do you see with the work that you do are those key barriers that are stopping that improvement taking place over time? Shall we start with you, Helen?
Yeah, I think farms have become very specialised, and so they don't have rotations. We've moved away from mixed farming, where you're putting something into the soil bank before you start drawing it out by way of your crop. So I think a return to mixed farming, I think, is really important to give that soil. You've got to. We always talk at the Soil Association about feed the soil, not the plant directly. So how do you get those manures or those roots, diverse cropping into the system so that you're actually building and regenerating the soil? And that is, that's a shift against the paradigm. And that's why, as Andrew has said, there's such a lot of risk for farmers, because they may have to completely change their farming system to start to look after their soils better. It can be some simple things, simple first steps, getting some cover crops, some catch crops in, planting a bigger diversity of things in the ground. We're learning more and more about how plant diversity drives soil fertility. But for it to go all the way can be a big shift. Learning new skills, buying new equipment, maybe bringing livestock back onto your farm alongside the cropping. Those are big shifts for farmers to take. But the great thing is, as others have said, farmers have suddenly got the plot. They suddenly recognise, 10 years ago, farmers were still in denial in some parts of the country about the fact that their soils were going to run out of steam. Now everybody seems to accept that and want to do something about it. So we're working with a willing audience now, and what we need to do is to break down the barriers and make it possible for them to change. And that's some of the things that I think Andrew and others already talked about a bit.
That's brilliant. Claire, in terms of with the farmers that you follow through that journey, what were the main barriers to them, and what have been some of the interesting insights they've had as you've followed them along?
Yeah, so not only the farmers, but we brought in some experts to talk about it. And one is Vicky Hurd from Sustain, and she very succinctly, I think, just starting with her point, and Helen's obviously alluded to it. So there's the training and support, especially in the transition period, which is between 3 to 7 years if you're going to become what we call regenerative, but truly regenerative. And then in addition to that, there's sort of access into sort of land access issues as well. And we see that with one farmer, well, actually two of the farmers, they really want to farm alone as new entrants, and they have two very good supportive landlords, and that's a really wonderful story. And we've seen it at screenings, actually. And just to put context, the other reason that it really hit me recently that soil is so important is that we have packed out huge auditoriums, picture house screenings. They've never seen a documentary sell so well. It has soil in the title, and but people are really engaging in that subject. But when we're there and they're watching, it's really lovely to watch the farmers and understand. What the other day we had a landowner and a farmer pair up, and actually that land access thing was and they were going to support them with the training and everything else. And also, as Helen says, it's being stuck in a system. So our film does not put the blame on the farmers. We need to stop looking at the farmers and putting blame on them. People like Helen who work really, really hard. And all the farmers we've supported and followed, not only the young ones, but then their mentors, like amazing people like John Pawsey, Marina O'Connell and Nick Renison, they have all stepped on their own into the as I'm sure Helen has as well, actually, because there's been no support from government systems, the supermarkets, they've just done it because they know they want to produce resilient and diverse farms for the future, because they see it as the only way of farming in the face of climate change with increased flooding and increased heat.
It's that quiet revolution that's been led by the farmers, and I think that's some of the challenges sometimes when we try and quantify the benefits, is that the farmers have been the ones that have been doing it have just been quietly getting on. They haven't taken some of the researchers with them, and so again quantifying some of that. Again, Lionel, what are the main barriers that you see in terms of within your work?
Yeah, I think I would start by saying one size does not fit all.
Absolutely.
Clearly. And one size does not fit all, even from 1 year to another year. Because we are working in agriculture, we are working in a changing environment every time. So that's something that is probably a huge barrier. And so that's very closely linked also to risk mitigation for the grower. So how am I making my decision? What can I decide? Mitigating my risk, keeping my farm on a financial equilibrium that is still viable, is still interesting. And so I think that's really definitely the biggest one. And I really like when we talk about education, because that goes into this. So because something you don't know keep you away from it also a little bit. And we in our program in Bayer, what we are also developing for the growers and for the farmers across Europe and across the globe is also to bring digital. Because digital and innovation is for sure part of the element that will help and will facilitate. Because, you know, we were talking just before this panel about you have plenty of data, you have plenty of things, but what do you do with that? And for sure, we are talking a lot about AI yesterday during this forum. Definitely, in this area, there is a lot to explore. There is a lot to bring to the growers to make sure that they are making the right and the best decision. And maybe allow me just to close on one element that also for me is super important. So first of all, we need to be granular. So again, because one size does not fit all, we need to help and to support every single piece of land that can be different, even from the one next to the road. So that's for sure. So we need to be very granular. So we need to go to the primary data acquisition. We need to get to this level of detail. And the last one, of course, and again, it was in the opening this morning, we should not ignore is we are talking a lot about here climate change mitigation, but the grower also have to play on the climate risk adaptation, and that is coming. So that means all the reference they have, all the knowledge they have for the last maybe decades, 20 years, 30 years, might not be relevant because the situation is changing. So that's also something for me that is an enormous barrier.
Absolutely. Andrew, anything to add in terms of on the barriers?
Yeah, I mean, actually, when I think about Soil Capital's now 11-year history as a business, we're sort of a living experiment of trying to answer that question, because, as I said earlier, we started as a pure agronomy firm. The model was selling advice to farmers to help them, knowledge. And Helen, you're exactly right. Farming in a more nature-friendly, nature-aligned way, using nature to solve problems rather than something out of a bag, is knowledge-intensive. You have to solve a whole set of familiar problems with new knowledge and frankly, new problems that come up as well. But what we discovered was that knowledge alone wasn't enough to create a sort of large-scale momentum. You know, we were working with lots of fascinating, open-minded farmers, like the sorts of profiles you're talking about, Claire, but it wasn't scaling on its own. And that's where we as a business came to the conclusion that actually one of the most important barriers, if not the most important barrier, is the system that farmers are operating in, which since the Second World War has been pointing at just one indicator of success, which is yield maximization. And you know, the result of that is very heavy commoditization of the value chain, and Helen talked about the results of that being very intense specialization of farming. But if your major financial reward is simply euros or pounds for the tons you produce, then all of the other micro decisions you make will lead to that one goal. And so what we've now been trying to do for the last 5 or 6 years is change that system goal in a pragmatic, incremental kind of way, which is to have the food and beverage value chain, supply chain, place an economic value for the farmers on the ecosystem services that they achieve alongside the output. And by putting a financial value on that, which some may have philosophical views about, and we can discuss that, you know, what we're seeing now is 1,500 farmers across Western Europe joining our program over the last 3 years, and data coming from them showing how they are systematically changing how they farm, and delivering results for climate, for resilience, for soil health. So for me, it's the system in which you operate, and specifically the financial reward for your business that's the key. Because farmers at the end of the day are entrepreneurial problem solvers. If they need to find new knowledge to deal with new problems, they will. But only if the system they're operating in is telling them, you must solve that.
And I think that segues us beautifully onto the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is this whole idea about soils as a carbon store. And, you know, if you do a quick Google search about it, you can find every different side of opinion in terms of whether soils are going to solve all of our issues around climate change. If you think about things like the 4 per thousand initiative, 0.04% increase in all of our soils globally would solve climate change. To the really other side of that discussion in terms of soils have no capacity to store carbon and everything in between. And so it's really interesting just to hear from you around how farmers can be supported, and maybe we'll start from the other end and come this way this time for you guys who are in this. How do you think, and again, Andrew, coming to you first, how do programs like the ones that you run with Soil Capital allow farmers to be supported to make the most of those opportunities that exist through these new marketplaces? And are there any challenges that they need to be aware of, or areas where we need to provide more support to them?
Zero challenges, it's plain sailing.
Absolutely, biological systems, we sorted it, absolutely, yeah.
Look, so as I said, we're running this regenerative agriculture transition program. We're using greenhouse gases and carbon, soil carbon, as a leading indicator of performance, but alongside other indicators on soil health and biodiversity and water. Is soil carbon sequestration the answer to global climate change? No, of course not. Can we move on? It's part of the solution. It can certainly help with buying time. It also does enormous value for resilience and for water management and for biodiversity restoration if we look after soils. So there are huge reasons to be giving farmers the support they need. In order to Soil Capital has been very involved in building, a marketplace. And to be clear, if it's not already clear, what we're doing is intermediating between farmers who are making practice changes and the buyers of their crops. So what some people call insetting or scope 3 reductions. We're not engaged in offsetting activities, for example. But farmers have no real clue how to quantify their greenhouse gas emissions or how the practices and the decisions they might make would affect the carbon and the organic matter in their soil. So there's a great deal of help that's needed around quantification, and that's the coming together of science and technology. And it's constantly evolving and it's never done, and you can have a whole panel conversation on that. And then I think the other big part of it is how to structure a new market activity which has high levels of integrity, using external standards and external audit, and everything's open book and transparent, but in a way that remains practical for farmers who are intensely practical people and cannot be wrapped up in endless bureaucracy and more paperwork than they need. So finding that balance actually is challenging, and that's also a job that is never done because standards and regulation and expectations are constantly evolving, and that's something that we've worked really hard as a business on our own to do, but we've also started to work with our peers in Europe and further afield to sort of federate different approaches and drive integrity at a market level where money is changing hands for these sort of outcomes.
I think that integrity is a key part, and obviously potentially something that's going to be picked up in other sessions to Dell. Lionel, for you, how do you think the opportunities are for farmers to dip their toe into some of this stuff that's happening within carbon markets?
Yeah, I think when we go to this question of value creation for the growers, it's important to understand finally where you stand. And indeed, when you talk about carbon and regen ag in general, you need to make sure that you are able to create value. And the way to create value is to be able to build something that you can finally monitor, report and verify. That the famous MRV topic. And that's super important, because if you don't have the growers to do the proper monitoring, to have the proper auditing system in place, etc., it will be very difficult to generate any kind of value. So we do feel in Bayer that we do need to develop these tools to support this activity and to make sure to bring the best-in-class element to the grower. So that's really for how to orchestrate this. Now, if we go through 3 different layers on this one, so grower. The growers, to do that, they need to understand. So they need to have the right lens in front of their eyes to be able to read properly what's happening on their farm, to make the right decision, to make the right to anticipate what might happen, to build the right scenario, to make the right decision, to write the right economics. So that's extremely important. But then that would be totally useless if that's not connected to the one that will leverage this value. And as you said, we are also focusing totally at the moment on the value chain. So all the big food chain company of the world, if you are totally disconnected from what this company wants, from what the retailers want, you will have a major problem because you are building up something and you are not creating connection. I've heard a lot about also in different panels in this forum the name of partnership. So we need to partner. We need to partner all together. Because we need to have a certain common sense of understanding. So if we are working in too many different directions, that would be very difficult to generate value. And my last insight on this one is we have not talked about this so far this morning, is about the policymakers. If you bring friends to play a game and you tell nobody if you will play football, cricket, baseball or whatever, and you give a meeting point on a given field of something, and everybody is coming with a basketball, a baseball bat on a tennis court, you have something that does not work. So we need to make sure that we have also the common sense of having the common readings, and that on this space, policy will definitely help. And that's okay. In the EU at the moment, that what's happening is fairly positive. We do see a lot of nice things happening in the EU at the moment in that direction to set certain rules, certain guidelines, because we really need all of us, even if we can be competitors in certain places, we need to have the kind of pre-competitive guidelines that are aligned. Otherwise, the one that will suffer from that will be the growers.
Absolutely.
Because they will do things that will not be valued, that will not be able to generate any profit for them. And that will be a big, big problem.
I think it's a really good point around how do we work more smartly and collaboratively in terms of coming up with those ways of measuring and reporting that actually allow the farmers to have trust in the system, but also those people further up the chain in terms of the buyers and policymakers to understand how that comes together. Yeah. Helen, I'd be interested in your thoughts because obviously, the conversations that we've been having already have been focusing very much on the sort of the arable side of it in terms of what can we do with growing. We've obviously got a huge proportion of our farmers that are in the livestock or the grass-based section, which potentially are at a disadvantage at the moment in terms of being able to think about what they can do with existing models. How, with the work that you're doing at the Soil Association, are you able to bring together the potential that grassland has to deliver some of these solutions through how those areas are managed?
Yes, so we're like Andrew, we're in that same game of how do we measure, support farmers to change and reward them through Soil Association Exchange, and we're working with you on the Farm and Carbon Toolkit on that front. And we see very few farms in the first 700 farms that we've measured. We see very few, about 3, that have actually got to net zero. It is a massive challenge for the agricultural sector to get there, particularly in the livestock sector when you've got ruminants because of the methane challenge. So plotting and helping farmers plot their best path to much lower emissions and net zero is really challenging. Soils can play part of a role, but we need to be monitoring those over a long period of time. And as Andrew said, they buy us some time. They don't necessarily, I think we're still in debate, they don't solve the whole problem at the farm level. But it's very important that our farmers have a whole farm plan, that they really do think about the mix of things that they're growing. We have been supporting within grassland systems and in arable systems agroforestry, so bringing trees as well as, alongside the trees, the other big sequesterer of carbon is going to be our trees and our perennial crops. How do we bring those into our productive farming systems in a way that's not just saying, okay, we're going to do some woodland planting over there, but actually making productive trees a part of the system? That can work incredibly well for livestock systems where they need that shade and shelter and browse and all the other things that might help reduce methane production and ammonia. There's a real designing of our landscapes around the kind of crops and animals we want to have in the future, and grassland is we know that we bank more carbon in grassland systems than we do in arable systems normally, so you've got an advantage there, but you've then got the challenge of what you're using to graze those lays. So it's tougher. But we have to find those pathways. Those pathways will involve trees as well as improving our soil management.
That's really helpful, thank you. And I think just following on from that, I think you highlight really nicely some of the complexities that we have within this system, as Andrew said, in terms of, it's not simple. Claire, I don't know for you whether your work that you've done in terms of following your farmers, how you see that actually those sort of pioneer farmers or those farmers that are doing things differently, they can help empower other farmers to sort of see that it is possible and it can be done and actually understand those practical things that they can change. Do you see that as a real role in moving forward?
Yeah, I do. I think when we were discussing here and I've heard the words of working together, I think one thing we've seen, and a gentleman was just here from a big cluster group, Northeast Cotswold Cluster, they're all working together, and that's a brilliant way of looking at carbon credits or biodiversity, natural capital. And Farm Carbon Toolkit work hugely on that as well, but they also look at water catchment areas, and it's a wonderful way of this whole systemic way of working. It's holistic. You cannot work in silos. It's working, and then that will help everything in your farm to improve. And as Helen says, you've got the trees, you've got the hedgerows and all of this thing, and as the farmers, you've got the herbal lays, you've got all that diversity, and all of those plants with deeper roots, they're going to be capturing more carbon for you and be in a permanent cycle. So there are all these incredibly complex biological systems which you need observation for, you need to learn those things, you need to step back, and but by working together is what we've seen with those farmers, and places like Groundswell, if you haven't been and you want to learn more, that's a really amazing learning event that happens at the end of June, and many people are now coming from different sectors there to learn. But those are the places, and Oxford Real Farming Conference, to bring together those ideas, and it should be working together. Do not work alone. There's too much when you go down, if you go further down into sort of personal health of farmers, it should be that.
There are, as I say, Groundswell, the ultimate soils party for anyone that hasn't attended. I really would recommend. So we'll move over to looking at some of the questions that have come in through the audience. So firstly, a really interesting one. Has the term regenerative been hijacked? And actually, what do we do around creating, I suppose, a sort of a definition of that allows people to understand what it is, farmers to engage with it, but also that value to then be I suppose, increased up the chain? Helen, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited by the fact that farmers have got excited about regenerative. It's really important that farmers start to see themselves in a different light, not just, as we heard earlier on, just chasing that yield goal, but thinking about all the other things they're going to deliver and wanting to get into soils and soil health and that kind of thing. But it is a very loose term with some very good principles, and you've got people who are perhaps interpreting it as sort of business as usual with the odd cover crop, and other people who are going really deeply into the processes, reducing the agrochemicals dramatically, if not getting rid of them altogether. So there's a real spectrum. Now, rather than over-define it at the moment, because I think that can be risky, I'm more interested in what are the outcomes, and that's why we're doing the measuring work. What are the outcomes from these changing farming systems? And let's learn by doing, rather than actually try and put it too much in a box, which might then feel like I'm not part of that club, so I can't get in there. I'm with the organic standards. We didn't define them finally for about 30 years after the organic movement was born. And I think there's a danger of trying to lock it up and saying this is exactly the standard you've got to meet so that we can do a consumer marketing thing. This is a farmer movement. It needs to stay with the farmers for now, and we need to be measuring how they do and learning what's working well in the real world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Claire, what do you think about the term regenerative? Is it a useful term?
Yeah, we've played with this term the whole way through our journey, and there is a lot of greenwashing, sadly, around it, and it's been co-opted, the phrase. But for us, real regeneration, as Helen is saying, so there are the basic principles that you can look into, which we have in the film, but we believe it's going beyond that. It's a social engagement. Perhaps it's changing routes to market. Is it the way we eat is changing? Also, are we looking at nutritional density? There's the whole huge factors of proper regeneration of our system. But I totally agree with Helen. I think to get more people involved, then we need to be inviting them into the space and not having that certification too early on. There are standards coming through. There's some new stuff happening, I think, very soon. Gabe Brown, who's the sort of Gloriana of the godfather of this movement, is coming over, and I think Waitrose is going to be announcing some stuff. So it'll be interesting to see how they're going to be presenting it to us, the customer of food systems. So yeah, always wary, but I love the word regeneration. If you really, really dig into it, it's a beautiful word. And then in the film we have a beautiful piece where Marina O'Connell says it's not enough to be sustainable. You need to be regenerating.
Fantastic, thank you. Lionel, for you, in terms of obviously your development of your regen platform, how does that definition help with you?
Yeah, I would say I'm totally with you. I think we have to be very careful not to make a kind of marketing instrument of this. So, but nevertheless, that's where the value will come from. So we need to help, I think, all the system to make sure that it's done properly. And what I'm very happy to see that there is more and more policies and decisions are made on greenwashing claims. So we want to stop companies say, hey, I've done that, what, and not having proof point or being so much active on this. So that's something for me I see as a very positive movement at the moment in terms of avoiding greenwashing claims around these topics. Then if we dive to the growers, I think the growers know very well what is their interest to go there. They know that growing their plant on an healthy soil will make them so much more resilient in terms of when there is a lot of waterfall, when there is pest management, etc. That makes better sense for them. So I think there is nothing to prove to the grower on this aspect. They know what's around, and again, every situation is so different that they have to adapt. Again, what they miss is how to do it. Yeah. So how to do it in a financial manner that is also viable. And that's super important. So what we place in there, let's make sure that we are all very careful, that we, in anything we do, we engage in the right direction. I think for the grower, it's totally clear on what the interest to go there. And again, depending if you're in Poland, in France, in Germany, in Spain, you might not activate the same things. So let's make sure that we are also fitting to the reality of the agriculture of the location. And let's be careful of being advocate every day to avoid these potentially greenwashing traps, I would say, on this one.
And Andrew, for you, finally, how does it seem like a good term in terms of that sort of engagement, or are there potential threats with it?
I'll be brief because I'm going to reinforce, I think, a lot of what's been said, although I will note that we work a lot in French-speaking markets where we don't have this conversation because it really doesn't work well in the French tongue. But look, I think the word works well, or this concept works well for two reasons in particular. One that Claire mentioned, which is this, it's a very engaging way to communicate that we have degraded soils to such an extent that it really isn't good enough just to sustain at what we've got. We really have this opportunity to turn it around. And that's the beauty of nature-based solutions. You can turn things around. So that I think is good. I think, Helen, your point about it being an inclusive movement, farmer-led movement now is good. There are not black and white definitions that immediately exclude certain farms of certain sizes or systems or so on. The outcomes measurement is the key here. It's been said now for several years, and I'm a little frustrated that we keep asking the question and we don't just accept that the way to tell greenwashing from not is to be quantifying the outcomes of that regeneration. And if a company or a farmer or anyone in between is not doing that, then that's where the question marks come out. So let's just accept that and move on, please.
Fabulous. So another question, and again, I think we'll come back to you, Andrew, in terms of Regen Ag has a scaling problem despite the long-term benefits. How can we drive finance to transitioning farmers over that short-term yield issues?
I think historically regenerative agriculture, or whatever term you want to use, has shown a scaling problem. But I think there are signals in the system of tipping points. Groundswell as a metric of farmer engagement has gone over the last 7, 8, 10 years from a very small peer-to-peer exchange to more like a festival now. The corporate engagement with it, like it or not, with its pluses and minuses, has gone on a non-linear trajectory in the last few years. So I think I think there are signals in the system that actually there are tipping points arriving. I'm not saying it's in the next year or 3 years or 10 years, but there's sort of stuff is shifting. For us at Soil Capital, it's not necessarily a question of mobilizing finance from banks and investors and sort of third-party sources, because frankly, a lot of farmers are already too indebted, and I'm not sure the solution is to put them further into debt. In fact, many farmers will say actually one of the draws of this transition is that with fewer inputs, they need less working capital, less debt, less stress. So I'm cautious around, I think there are needs for external sources of capital in certain instances. If you're going to install trees in your fields, agroforestry, there's a capital investment sort of implication of funding those trees, and that's interesting. For us, where it comes back to the financial side is absolutely what's happening within the value chain. The share of value that farmers have enjoyed throughout the value chain over time has declined from small to pathetically small. And we need to get back to at least small and broaden that out, because that's where the action's happening, and that's the signal that will drive the scale.
Very quickly.
Very quickly. Just one very quick thing on this one. It's just by experience that from project we have been running in Spain and in Poland, I think the circular economy dimension is also extremely important on this one, because depending on where you stand as a grower, you might not have the same opportunity to change your crop system or to move to different type of crop system, whether who will be able to value what you will change. If you want to bring, for example, peas in your rotation, if you have nobody that's able to collect peas around you, it's nonsense. So if you want to improve the way you are fertilizing, if you have cattle around in the area you are living, your story will be totally different if you're in a region where there is no cattle around. So it's also a question to the circular economy dimension of this for me, for the financial and the economic viability is extremely important. So we need again to build the right region to assess what we have to do.
Fabulous, thank you. We're really drawing to the end of this now, so I suppose, Helen, actually, if I can just come to you in terms of, obviously we're in this exhibition today around innovation. What do you think, or what would be the one thing you'd want people to take away in terms of the opportunities or the new innovations that we have within this area around soil health and carbon sequestration?
I think one of the challenges in the innovation space is that a lot of the things we need, as Andrew said and others have said, this is a knowledge-rich rather than product-rich area of activity. And so a lot of research has been focused around wealth-creating products that you can sell to a farmer, rather than the knowledge that a farmer needs to actually manage their land better. So I'd call out to the research community, make sure you're thinking about the public interest in this and that the knowledge that farmers need to share. And farmers are driving that. There's, farmer-led research is something we've been really supportive of, trialing things, giving support through small grants to farmers so that they can actually do this stuff. That should be much more normal, and government funding should be much more geared that way. So there's a big knowledge gap. We're learning a lot really fast. We need to be monitoring and measuring the changes we're seeing on our farms, but we need to be supporting through that development of knowledge rather than more products, so that farmers can make this transition.
Fabulous. A great note to end on. So again, I think hopefully you can agree it's been an absolutely fascinating session. We could have spent the whole morning talking about this. It's such an so if you could just join me in thanking our wonderful panel. So Andrew, Lionel, Claire and Helen, and thank you to you guys for coming along.
Thank you.
Thanks, Becky.